Social prescribing is a holistic approach to healthcare. It's not just about physical and mental health, it really emphasizes the social aspect of health as well. It is meant to connect individuals to community-based supports, thus improving their overall health.
I'm seeing a huge impact of social prescribing in my clients. Their need to access care, especially in a ER setting or in a hospital setting, is much reduced.
We know, and the evidence is there, and the research demonstrates someone having self-worth, feeling connected, that sense of belonging. There's just so much value to that.
It seems like a daunting task to add this additional step of talking to a patient about their social health, but it's really not. There's a simple way to connect someone to services that exist.
Having a link worker at your facility, you can then refer your client to that link worker, who then can explore what are the patient's goals, what do we need to achieve.
You really need a lot of social interaction with others, and you need to be involved.
All the courses that I've taken have changed my life quite a bit, like how to control it whenever there's stress in my life or pain, chronic pain.
A lot of the people feel a lot better after they leave, and they're able to talk to different people and not feel alone.
Social prescribing is an amazing initiative. It is something that social workers have been doing for a really long time and now has a direct focus and stream.
Low barrier access to supports that are immediate really help get traction on people's needs.
Social prescribing should be incorporated in day-to-day clinical practice.
Social prescribing is like a warm hand of connection and care. It really provides an opportunity to develop a deeper and trusting relationship with an individual that can have the possibility of improving health and well-being.
Good morning. My name is Sarah Hobbs, and I have the privilege of working at the Alliance for Healthier Communities as the CEO. I will begin with a land acknowledgement. We recognize that the work of the Alliance for Healthier Communities and Alliance members takes place across what is now called Ontario on traditional territories of the Indigenous people who have lived here since time immemorial and have deep connections to these lands. We further acknowledge that Ontario is covered by 46 treaties, agreements, and land purchases, as well as unceded territories. We are grateful for the opportunity to live, meet, and work on this territory. Ontario continues to be home to vibrant, diverse Indigenous communities who have distinct and specific histories and needs, as well as constitutionally protected and treaty rights. We honor this diversity and respect the knowledge, leadership, and governance frameworks within Indigenous communities. In recognition of this, we commit to building allyship relationships with First Nation, Inuit, and Métis peoples in order to enhance our knowledge and appreciation of the many histories and voices within Ontario. We also commit to sharing and upholding responsibilities to all who now live on these lands, the land itself, and the resources that make our lives possible.
She needs to go back.
We will now hear from Sabrina Morrison, the Black Focus Social Prescribing Navigator at Taibu CHC.
Greetings and grand rising. Good morning. My name is Sabrina. Thank you, Sarah. That was beautiful. I shifted. I was going to do land acknowledgement in my home, and now I'm outside because this is the place to be. So pouring libation is an ancient African way to acknowledge the land that we're on and to remember our ancestors, remember those who came before us, remember those who did all the work so we can be here free and speak as Black people, as Black women, as women, and just free overall. So I'm going to use spring water today, but some traditions, they use rum or gin, but I love spring water. And so I'm going to invite some of us to join if you feel comfortable to do so. So how this works is we pour libation and we call the names that came before us. It could be your living or lived ancestors, your blood lineage, or just someone that you know, or it could be a revolutionist, anyone that is pivotal in your life, in your mission, and who contributed to why you are here, free and able to be. Ashe? Yeah? All righty. So I'm going to open this up. Not that cold, so I'm happy. We give thanks, we give thanks, we give thanks. We give thanks who came before us. We give thanks to our relative. We give thanks for the blood, sweat, and tears, for their courageous. We give thanks. We give thanks for those who had a voice. We give thanks for those who didn't have a voice, but had those deep, deep, deep silent prayers. We give thanks for the connection of fire, air, moisture, and earth that our ancestors utilized to be, to have, to combat. I'm going to pour libation, and I'm just going to call the names. You can call it silently in your mind or out loud if you would like. If you want to join, if you don't, you can just sit in silence and hold peace in your mind, body, spirit, and emotions. Ashe. Salvador, Mary, big boy. Ultimate truth, and I'm just pouring it on the ground, so I'll go there like that. Martin, King, Francis, John, all those who came before us. Ashe, 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 ashe. We celebrate, we give thanks. We give thanks to our Indigenous brothers and sisters because we are on their land. And we give thanks for the blood that runs through us with that DNA memory and that DNA intelligence. I'm complete, and I'm going to pass this back to Sarah, I believe. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for that powerful acknowledgement, Sabrina. Before we begin, I would like us to take a moment to reflect on the countless individuals and communities affected by the conflicts and turmoil in various parts of the world. Let us extend our thoughts to those striving for peace. I want to welcome you all to the 2023 Alliance for Healthier Communities Social Prescribing Conference, Cultivating Connections. Today is a significant day for us all as we gather with a shared purpose to explore, discuss, promote, and improve the transformative power of social prescribing and the profound role of human connection in our lives. For us, Cultivating Connections is not just a theme, it's a call to action. It underscores the critical role that human connection plays in our health and well-being. It reminds us that true health extends beyond physical well-being. It encompasses emotional and social wellness as well. Social prescribing is one of the most promising solutions to address the issues of isolation and loneliness in our communities. For Alliance member centers, it is the way that we have always worked, but the framework for social prescribing lets us measure the impact, and we have come a long way since our first pilot project in 2018. Now, through our Black-focused social prescribing project, our Links to Wellbeing for Older Adults project, and our Social Prescribing for Better Mental Health projects, we can show that these initiatives are making a difference and have the potential to support a stretched health system. Today, we will delve deep into this subject, exploring its many facets, tools, and learnings from the experiences of link workers, clinicians, practitioners, and researchers. Our goal is to walk away from this day with the latest research and innovations. We hope that you enjoy the conference and that you can take what you learned today and apply it to your work. And of course, we hope to see you at the Human Connections events tomorrow. Now, we are going to take a moment to understand who you are, who is joining us today. And to do that, we have Natasha Baudin, Social Prescribing Lead at the Alliance.
Bonjour à tous, je vais parler un peu en français. Alors, je m'appelle Natacha, je suis la responsable du projet de prescription sociale ici à l'Alliance. Je pense que l'un des aspects les plus intéressants de la prescription sociale est qu'il s'agit d'une façon de parler de la promotion de la santé et du développement communautaire, mais aussi de mettre ces méthodes de travail au premier plan pour alléger la charge de nos collègues cliniciens. J'aimerais aussi juste prendre un petit moment pour remercier nos partenaires, en particulier nos partenaires principaux, l'Association des centres pour aînés de l'Ontario et le projet Links to Wellbeing, qui est financé par un donateur anonyme. Je tiens aussi à remercier notre bailleur de fonds, l'Agence de la santé publique du Canada, et un grand merci à nos autres organismes partenaires, la Comité de la santé des Noirs, Indigenous Primary Healthcare Council, l'Institut canadien de prescription sociale, Centre de la Colombie-Britannique, Center for Effective Practice et nos commanditaires délicieux d'envoi postaux tels que les tisanes, la crème glacée et le chocolat. Alors, faisons maintenant quelques petits sondages pour voir qui est dans la salle aujourd'hui. So we will just take a moment to do a quick little poll to see who is in the room today with us. So if you want to head on, you can see the QR code here to join us at Slido to complete the polls. So we'll just give everyone a few seconds to join us at Slido. Vous pouvez venir nous rejoindre ici au Slido. And once you're in Slido, you can start answering the questions. Where are you zooming in from? Fill it in. If you're coming from Canada, which province? If you're coming from outside of Canada, which country? We just want to know who is joining us in the room today. Okay, a lot of Ontario representation. Oh, other provinces are joining in. Looks like we do have representation from all across the country and other countries as well. Okay, let's move to the next question. I saw a lot of Ontario in the house. Feel free to get specific. What part of Ontario are you zooming in from? Okay, I see a lot of Toronto, but I see a lot of not Toronto as well from different parts of the province. It looks like we have good representation from across the province, the advantage of a virtual conference. Now we want to know, what is your field? What area do you work in? So we have an option for other, but if you're in healthcare, working with seniors, social services, community services, research, policy, government, decision makers, arts and culture, other. So we have a wide range of folks in different fields and different areas here today joining us. We'll give that one a couple more seconds. Everyone can see who's in the room. And then a question about roles. So if you, hopefully everyone's having enough time to put their vote in. So what is your role? Are you a link worker? Are you a navigator? Are you a health promoter, a community developer, a clinician, doctors, nurses, nurse practitioners, manager, a leader, an executive leader, researcher, social worker, community worker, student. Maybe you have some other fantastic role I haven't included. I'll give that a couple more seconds for people to get their vote in and share who you are. Great. Last two questions. Asking where are you working? Are you working in an urban center? Oh. Maybe and then, or a suburban setting or a rural setting. So asking about setting. And then the final question for our poll is if you're working with a particular population. I know we have a lot of folks joining us today working with older adults. We have our Black focused social prescribing and culturally specific social prescribing. We have folks working in the Indigenous community, and we have others doing social prescribing with children and youth, and some people are doing social prescribing with the whole population. So just taking the temperature on that. Wonderful. Welcome, everyone. I hope you have a great day. I'll pass it back over to Sarah.
Thank you, Natasha. What a fabulous mix of people we have with us today. It is with great pleasure that I introduce you to someone who embodies the spirit of cultivating connections in her work. Jay Pitter, a placemaker, author, and advocate for social justice. Jay will take us on a groundbreaking exploration that will change how we think of our centers, communities, cities, and neighborhoods to promote equity, inclusivity, and health, all while fostering the human connections that are so vital to our well-being. I am thrilled to hand the virtual stage over to our keynote speaker, Jay Pitter. Jay, the floor is yours.
So I normally have the wonderful opportunity of presenting to urban planners like myself, architects, engineers, and other place-based professionals. But today is a special extra privilege to be able to present to community health leaders and frontline heroes, not only because of the importance of your mandate, but also because there is such an interconnectivity between place-based work and community health / public health work. I should also share with you that I am the very proud daughter of a retired nurse, and so really have insights into, again, the incredible value and the importance of your work. During the next 40 minutes or so, I am going to connect the strands from our two professions together, share the origin stories of the work that we do, and then really talk about how ideas from both professions have informed my place-based social prescription model. Slide, please. So let's get into it. I don't have to explain to any of you here today what social prescription is. We know that it is extraordinarily centered on the individual, and it really is a prescription that uses social interventions that is co-created between the professional and individuals to contribute to individual and community health. Slide, please. Thank you. Here we go. So again, we know, you all know what social prescribing is, so I'm not going to describe that for you, but what I am going to do is to begin to define what place-based social prescription is. So it builds on the critically important work that you do, but it just goes one step further. So we acknowledge the well-known fact that the quality of places significantly impacts population health, including physical health, mental wellness, mobility, and belonging. belonging. The place-based social prescription model that I've developed in my practice goes a bit further by not only analyzing how the quality of places or even how providing spaces that foster belonging contribute to individual and community health, but I look at how place itself can be used to radically improve community health using an equity-based placemaking model. And what that means is placemaking looks at the design, policy, and programming of public spaces. And we're looking at it as a central part of a continuum of care and overall community health. Slide, please. So why is place-based social prescription urgently needed now? Well, Stats Canada released a survey in 2020 that asked how mental health had changed since physical distancing began. And that survey found that 52% of respondents indicated that their mental health was either somewhat worse or much worse. 88% of respondents said that they had experienced at least one symptom of anxiety 2 weeks prior to completing the survey, and 71% of individuals reported feeling nervous, anxious, or on edge. I will let you know that after SARS, my mother worked during the SARS crises, and after SARS, up to 10 years after SARS, people were feeling a sense of a lack of belonging, anxiety, and depression. And so the social prescription model really meets the moment by getting ahead of some of these community health issues that we're going to see emerging over the next decade or so. And we're hoping that we can really disrupt that. The other reason that this model is so urgently important now is that we have an epidemic of loneliness across cities, rural communities, and everything in between. We are also facing high levels of poverty, unemployment. We have polarization of place. If you look on the internet and in the public square, it is all protest and polarization, and all of these things impacts community and mental wellness. Let's keep rolling. Slide, please. And so I'd love to just very quickly unpack the connection of urban planning and urban development in relation to public health, which is of course connected to community health. Slide, please. And so the colonial settlement planning primarily focused on exploration, good water supply, defense, and food production. It displaced Indigenous peoples and it erased their settlement patterns while creating the form for Canadian landscapes that we see today. One thing that I always tell my colleagues is that urban planning, the profession that we work in, and all land use professions are linked to the colonial project. All of these professions are, when you think about surveying land, assessing the quality of land, and who gets to live on particular land, all of that is connected to the colonial project. What we see is that in the early 60s and the mid 70s, we have urban reform movements co-led by government and citizen groups. And that was in large part because we started seeing a crisis of public health and community health. In fact, in 1910, the chief medical officer went to a conference and he declared that public health is no longer to be classed as an imponderable, but as a ponderable entity to be dealt with along the lines as exact as the building of railways in minimum grade or the getting the highest mechanical efficiency out of a well-constructed steam machine. I'm going to put that in plain language. What he was saying is that our infrastructure, our technology, our built environment, public health is actually as important as that. The health of people during that time was elevated to being a national asset and a significant resource. Slide, please. And so from that time, from 1890 throughout 1914, there were a number of concerns that were being addressed in both of our professions. And so what we started seeing was disease coming out of places that were described as slums. I want to say, as a public housing kid, respectfully, that those places had a lot of intelligence and social trust and cohesion. However, they weren't planned properly and they didn't have all of the right systems. And then as we go on in history, we see wartime housing emerging. We see committees coming up to address the idea of place and public health, hand in hand. As we move into the mid 1900s, we see things like CMHC. Housing, as you know, is a determinant of health. So we see housing institutes emerging. We see more policy emerging. The Town Planning Institute of Canada becomes the Canadian Institute of Planners. We start now incorporating some environmental thinking into public health as well. And finally, we make it to the 21st century. We finally begin to acknowledge indigeneity and coloniality and the harm that that has done to the health of so many Indigenous communities, but the health of our country. So now we're dealing with truth and reconciliation. We have a world forum. We're looking at resilient cities, and all of these things are bound up in place and public health or community health. Slide, please. So between health, there's this really beautiful connection between health and the built environment. And so the sociocultural features of a neighborhood, including community support networks, act as channels through which neighborhoods impact our perception of health and ensuing health behaviors. We know that communal spaces like parks and recreational facilities, I'm going to add childcare and elder care as well, that also really defines community health as well. Then we look at public transit and the quality of our streets. And so again, there's such a strong connection throughout history. However, our professions tend to work in silos. And I believe that that is why we're not experiencing optimum outcomes. Slide, please. And so place-based factors that adversely impact individual and community health are multifarious. There's something called bad density. I'll jump into that a little bit more in a couple of moments. There's also precarious housing, violence and unsafety, food deserts, lack of local amenities, car-centric infrastructure, a lack of flexible and culturally responsive gathering spaces, the criminalization of people experiencing mental health crises in our public spaces, the lack of access to green spaces, the lack of representation in public health. For example, there are dominant histories that are shared in the public realm. However, we don't see statues and commemoration of everyday people and unsung heroes. 85% of our statues are of men, and generally speaking, white men and colonial sort of figures. And so we're not seeing the contributions of women and LGBT plus people, our elders and young people within the public realm. And that does impact one's sense of being seen and belonging in community. Slide, please. And so when I think about this history, about our two professions and how place and community health have emerged hand in hand, this history is not strictly professional for me. It is profoundly personal. Slide, please. I grew up in a public housing community on the east end of the city. It is a community called Cataraqui. When I started my practice after leaving an architectural firm approximately a decade ago, I went back to the community to audit it. I was looking at the connection between design and the health of my community. I was very much looking at it through the lens of being a child in my neighborhood. And so you'll see me here in this photo essay. I'm behind my building. You'll see that foreboding caution sign on the door right there. We didn't have a library, a swimming pool in my community. We didn't have, so many amenities and safe spaces. You can see me standing in front of my elevator in my neighborhood. Every time I came home from school, I was met with a puddle of urine, or worse, a pile of human feces. That is the elevator that I traveled up in and back as a child. And I remember that it would be stuck at least 50% of the time. And by the time I was 9 years old, I stopped being afraid of, being stuck in the elevator and having it plummet to my death. I developed a certain kind of resilience that I now know is quite unhealthy, but was required to actually survive the indignity of the poor design in my neighborhood. And if you look at the worn out carpet there, it really broke my heart. It was worn down to the rubber. It was as though the carpet hadn't been changed for decades since my mother had moved us out of the community. You now see me standing in front of a maisonette. I'm actually standing in front of the home where a friend's mother used to do sex work at lunchtime, and there would be a line of men sometimes in front of her front door. And I think about women in my community, and girls as well, who were sexually exploited in that community because it was located at the end of a dead-end street, and people in my community were not seen as having real human value. We were really isolated in the context of the city. Here you see me in my hallway. Look to the bottom left of my screen. What you're seeing there is there's an opening in the stairwell. It is large enough for a child who is 10 to 12 years old to fall through to their death. I, remember as children, we sensed that and we felt that. And, decades later, the best Toronto community housing could do is put up some sort of fencing to close it off, rather than invest the money in creating safe design in that stairwell. You see me in the laundry room. This was another site of real sort of place-based trauma in my childhood. People who were unhoused or using drugs would sleep in the laundry room. And so it was always, a bit dangerous and foreboding walking past the door or being sent down to do laundry, as many of us children did, because our families were working full time. And most of our households were single-led families. What I want to tell you about growing up in the community is that my two greatest examples growing up in that community is my immigrant Caribbean Canadian mother, who came here for more opportunity and found that as a newcomer, pathways were closed to her. We lived in this community for about a decade. And then one day my mother got up off the couch, because I know that she was quite depressed, working in factories, getting laid off quite frequently, living beneath the poverty line. My mother actually went back to high school at the same time that my older sister was attending high school, got herself to college, and became a registered nurse. The other person who was so important in my own personal story while growing up in this community was my second grade teacher, who would come to my community, an Irish Canadian gay man. He would come to my community during the summers and take me to the symphony, take me to the library, and show me that there were actually places that fostered a sense of beauty and belonging and worth and value. And he became a second father to me. And so these are the two people who really shaped my experience and actually saved my life, because there are a number of people who grew up in this community who suffered just unspeakable trauma and harm. In fact, when I was 12 years old, an underage sex trade emerged in the building that you are looking at right now. And my friend's slightly older sister became entangled in that sex trade. And one day she went missing. And I remember being 12 and watching the news. And the reporter said that been found, but she had been mutilated, cut up in so many small pieces that she was unrecognizable outside of her dental records. I remember the next day, all of us kids, 12, 13, 14 years old, expected to just go to school and continue on with our routines without any community health interventions, living in a neighborhood where we were so exposed again to bad policy, bad design, and terrible community health outcomes, not only diminished health, but also as serious as death. Slide, please. So when I come to this work and I'm talking about the critically important role that the community health lens plays when we're talking about creating prosperous, safe, and vital communities, I'm not speaking to it from a theoretical standpoint. I am indeed an adjunct urban planning professor. I've lectured at Harvard and Princeton. I know the theory, I know the research, but I know it on a cellular, spiritual, lived experience level where it matters most. And so in my practice, I incorporate this lens of community health, community well-being in place as social prescription in the projects that I lead. And so I lead projects that are at the intersection of urban planning and social justice. And here's how I have incorporated a place-based social prescription practice into my binational firm. So many of you may remember the mass shooting that happened on the Danforth. Within a week of that shooting, I collaborated with the University of Toronto, and I led a walk back onto the Danforth because the space was stained with fear and anxiety. And if you look to the left of my screen, you can see I rallied up along with my partner at U of T, people from all walks of life, races, classes, genders, and we got back out on that street. And as we walked, we talked about how people felt being in the space. We talked about what it would take for healing. We talked about how each of us is responsible for each other's sense of safety and belonging. And we talked about different forms of street-based safety issues that impact our individual and collective sense of wellness and health. I do a lot of work in the American South, redesigning and reimagining Confederate monument sites, bringing together African Americans, sold at many of these sites, and white Americans. And now we're also seeing other, equity deserving groups moving into the South, such as folks from LGBT plus communities. We're also in the States starting to talk more about Indigenous peoples' lands. They use the term Native over there. We do a lot of that work. And so when I was working on a project called Reimagining Cheapside, this was a project where 2 Confederate monuments were removed from a large public square in the downtown. This is a site where African Americans were bought and sold for many centuries. And, a lot of the African American community members said over and over again, this site is cursed. I can feel the suffering of my ancestors at this site. So I knew that I had to do more than deliver good renderings and sketches for what the site could look like. We needed to talk about and to heal what the site felt like and how it was compromising people's mental health. And so I brought the community together and we did something called a witnessing circle. And in the witnessing circle, people from all identities and walks of life, we read out the names of African Americans who were bought and sold at that site. And together as a community, we committed to never again having a context where people could be dehumanized, whether they were African American, whether they were people suffering from mental health crises in the site, whether they were unhoused people or queer folks or single mothers. And so we did that ceremony, that place-based ceremony, as a form of healing and place-based social prescription. Slide, please. So also, when I was working in Vancouver on the redevelopment of Granville Bridge, which is one of the largest bridges in Canada, I led a convening for women, looking at the ways that women experience the bridge and the downtown overall. And during that convening, this woman on my screen, an Indigenous woman who's actually a former city councilor named Andrea, she said that she had heard a whispering or an inkling that during the second iteration of the bridge's development, a group of street-involved, low-income, primarily Indigenous women had been pushed out, and it somehow was connected to the missing and murdered Indigenous women's crises in this country. Now, when I walked away from that sharing, I thought, how could this bridge's redevelopment history be connected to that history? But one of the mottos that we have in this practice is that we believe women and we believe communities. And so we did deep research, and through our research, we actually found a provincial declaration and apology acknowledging that the bridge's redevelopment did indeed push a large number of Indigenous women into East Hastings. And the report said, quote unquote, it created a killing ground for this country's most notorious serial killer, Robert Pickton. And so in this instance, when we ask women who are not engaged in the design of public places, when we ask women, tell us the story of this place, tell us how it impacts you, tell us what other women are saying about this place. By listening to women, we were able to cull such a critical piece of history. I brought it back to the municipality, and they took it into advisement and made sure that, you know, in this phase of the bridge's redevelopment, that we are thinking about how design can, in fact, harm community health and individual well-being and safety. When I started my practice, the woman to your right here, her name is Carrie-Ann Agawa. I started my career as a very young and one of the first Black public funders, and I was working in cultural policy and planning. Carrie-Ann Agawa was one of my clients at the time. She had just survived breast cancer, double mastectomy, was running marathons and leading drum circles in her community. And I had the privilege to be welcomed into her Indigenous community. I've been to her homelands. And so when I started my practice, Carrie-Ann actually called me up and said, Jay, I want to invite you to participate as the only non-Indigenous consultant for a convening that I am doing with Indigenous public health workers. And so when I was doing that work, what I learned was that Indigenous public health and community health workers, primarily working with families and women, were facing trauma in the work that they were doing themselves. And so together with my collaborator at the time, architect Adam Brander, we worked with those women to do asset-based mapping around the places where they worked, to identify sites of respite and joy and healing, so that they could go to those sites and create rituals at those sites so that they could be nurturing and taking care of themselves as they were taking care of the public health and community health concerns within their own communities. Slide, please. I want to share with you as well broader place-based social prescription examples. So for instance, in the city of Toronto and right across Canada, municipalities have finally figured out that one of the egregious impacts of colonialization is that by colonializing and displacing Indigenous peoples off their lands, we've really impacted their sense of, collective and individual wellness and health. And so now we're changing policy to make sure that there are sites within our public spaces, particularly our green spaces and parks, where Indigenous peoples can conduct sacred healing rituals and other types of gatherings where they have connections to their waters, and all of of these things are connected to place-based social prescription, where we make sure that policies and, other prohibitive barriers such as, having permits and money isn't preventing people from using and accessing land and place as a way of healing, primarily starting with Indigenous peoples as we are on Indigenous lands, and also thinking about other communities, immigrants coming here from countries where they suddenly find themselves disconnected from the place-based rituals and that keep them well and that kept them well in their countries of origin. I do a lot of work on safe street design. And so another example here is looking at how car-centric infrastructure, it's made our streets quite unsafe for pedestrians and cyclists, and many cyclists are unnecessarily being murdered on our streets. And so a ritual among the cycling community is that when a cyclist is murdered, as a healing ritual, they create these ghost bikes. And so they take a bike, they paint it white, and they create a roadside sort of memorial as a way of healing and collectively grieving in the public realm. Slide, please. In New Orleans in the United States, there's something called the Black Jazz Funeral. This is something that emerges from the plantation into the public realm. When Black people died, oftentimes there wasn't money to bury them. And so these funerals was a way for Black people to grieve in public, but also celebrate the life of the ancestor who passed in public space and raise money also for the funeral. And so this is a place-based social prescription in the face of death and structural anti-Blackness, where even during mourning, we dance, we laugh, we share, and we support each other economically, spiritually, and socially. As I mentioned before, there is indeed a loneliness epidemic in this country. And so a Dutch supermarket started this pilot for slow checkout lanes in grocery stores. It is for people who are feeling lonely, who actually go to the grocery store, not only to buy items, but to have a slow conversation with the cashier. There are some folks on my team who've said, wow, that's really sad that we have to have a slow checkout for elders to be received and seen and to not feel such a sense of disconnection in their communities. And I agree with that. And I also think that it is a very clever form of place-based social prescription, and it's responsive. Slide, please. And so in the States, we have this park in San Diego looking at a Chicano hub where their culture is celebrated, it's visual, it can be seen. That is so critically important. Our mental health is so impacted by our sense of being seen in the world, being witnessed, not surveilled, but witnessed in the world. And so this kind of place, murals, public art, all of that is a part of place-based social prescription. The last broader example I will share with you is very personally important to me. All of these examples are. This one, though, happened in the aftermath of George Floyd. I actually shut my practice down for a whole year to do really unyielding advocacy after this issue. George Floyd was executed publicly, lynched in a perfectly beautiful, perfectly safe bike lane. But he wasn't safe, because safety is not just about physical features or slick design or infrastructure. I know all of you know that. It is so connected to social issues, imbalanced power relations, fraught histories of oppression. And so after George Floyd's execution in Minneapolis, a friend and colleague of mine named Anthony Taylor gathered the community together and led something called a slow ride. And so Black folks got on bikes and they slowly rode through the intersection together, acknowledging the pain of his murder acknowledging the pain and the chaos of the advocacy and the riots that took place in the city in response to this injustice. They then went to a park, they looked at some art, and then they went and shared food together. So all of this, a part of place-based social prescription. Slide, please. And okay, we have more examples, the Fletcher Street Urban Riders Club. So I definitely did not know that in Philadelphia, there's a history of Black cowboys. And so there are a lot of place-based challenges in Philadelphia, poverty, violence. We know that all of these things contribute to diminished individual and community wellness and health. And so there's this horse stable there where young people who are connected to whether it's gang violence or struggling with anxiety and depression, they can come to this place, groom horses, help to steward the space, ride horses as a way of self-healing and collectively healing. And then also in Chicago, we have the Legacy Walk, where people who belong to the LGBT plus community, communities that have been publicly bashed on streets, communities that have been asked to keep their love in the closet rather than on full display on our streets like the rest of us. This is a walk where individuals can walk through the community and hear their stories and see themselves in the design of these like street lights that go along the avenue. And whenever I think about these kinds of initiatives, I do think about my second grade teacher who became my second dad, because, he came of age in the 50s and 60s, and he was never able to come out. And that is something that really breaks my heart, because this man who played such a large role in ensuring that my life was so spacious, that I felt like I belonged wherever I was, he was in the closet. And I really think about him quite often, and I make sure that I incorporate an LGBT plus lens as well as, other equity-based lenses into my practice. Slide, please. And so we have a couple of other monuments here. We see the monument for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Winnipeg. And, someone quotes here that it doesn't bring closure, but it's a place for people to come. Indigenous peoples, imagine that, on their own lands, do not have a place to come together and individually to heal from ongoing genocide and colonialization. And so now when we see these monuments, when we see these physical manifestations in the public realm through the lens of wellness and healing, it's very much critically important. And then we have the Comfort Women statue, again, thinking about women's violence in public realm, women in war, and children, how women and children are violated and exploited in war. And so we have another similar monument coming from another place in the world. Slide, please. And so here is my place-based social prescription model. I have 4 buckets. I will just go through it with you at a very high level. So we have place-based grieving and healing rituals that includes things like Indigenous sweat lodges and sacred fires, social justice marches and public protests, community gardens and horticulture therapy, forest bathing, hiking and tree planting ceremonies, river baptisms, community cleansing baths, immersion healing and water offering ceremonies. I think about the wonderful libation that Sabrina poured today. That too is place-based social prescription. Thank you so much again, Sabrina, for that beautiful moment in today's proceedings. So we have ancestral pilgrimages and solidarity pilgrimages and rite of passage pilgrimages, all of these things deeply rooted in place. Another bucket that I have is place-based storytelling, commemoration, and celebration. So attending block parties and street festivals, adding respectful context to colonial symbols and historically fraught sites, installing digital stories to share those undertold stories in the public realm. So having more commemorations that don't just celebrate war heroes and people with 50,000 degrees, but let's celebrate people who are doing the frontline work, the unsung heroes, the elders, the people who keep us safe in our communities every single day. We are talking about things like front porch concerts and community dinners, facilitating intergenerational community storytelling circles and cross-cultural neighbor interviews. So your neighbor moves in, send your child over to interview an elder who lives next door. Let's look at place-based networks of care, things like volunteering at seniors' homes, food banks, and animal shelters, attending faith-based services, leading asset-based safety walks and belonging mapping, contributing to local food rescue, zero waste, clothing swaps. And the final category that I have here is looking at our place-based routines, mapping peace, joy, safety, and curiosity routes. Imagine how much better our days would be if every single one of us created a personal map that had our peaceful place, our joyful place, our safe or safer place, and our place of curiosity, and made sure that we got to one of those places every single day, walking, rolling, and cycling to destinations, patronizing local coffee shops, bookstores, restaurants that serve as welcoming community anchors of belonging, visiting cultural sites such as galleries, theaters, and informal gathering places that evoke a sense of cultural connection, curiosity, and wellness, taking breaks in parks, library nooks, and public squares, and participating in meetup groups and other mutual aid groups in our communities. And so this is the model that I have created with 4 clear categories: place-based grieving and healing rituals, place-based storytelling, commemoration and celebration, place-based networks of care, and place-based routines. In this model, I look at both the structural, the interpersonal, and also the macro and the micro. I look at policy, but I also look at things that we can do every single day as well. Slide, please. So here are a few considerations for equitable place-based social prescription. All place-based social prescribing is occurring atop Indigenous peoples' lands, and thus should consider the ways that their practices have been erased through colonization and ongoing displacement. Urban planning and design, community, wellness work, none of this is neutral work. It is all linked to the colonial project, and it is happening on lands that have very fraught histories, and that has to be centered in the work that we do. And then when we center that, we also think about exploited and stolen Black people's labor on these lands. We also think about immigrant exploited labor, women's exploited labor on these lands, and how all of these land-based histories have diminished the sense of individual and community wellness. Let's also think about individuals and communities, the fact that individuals and communities have been engaged in multiple forms of place-based social prescribing long before the term was coined, and that should be recognized. You know, I work at the intersection of research and academia, and sometimes I have to laugh at myself and my colleagues who work in an academic context. We are so annoying. We have $1 million term for every little thing. Sometimes we can squeeze the life out of things by over-institutionalizing it, overly, taking things that are informal, taking things that have alchemy, things that are intangible, and trying to force it into frameworks and force it into words and theory and language. And we shouldn't do that. Sometimes it's okay if we don't have a verbal or an intellectual or an institutional expression for every component of every single thing. That's okay. And so as we are advancing this critically important social prescribing model and framework, it is radical, it is responsive, it is progressive, but let's remember, let's not hold it down on the ground and squeeze all of the life and the authenticity out of it. Let's allow some of it to be beyond our verbal, physical, or policy expression. Also, some individuals and communities may never feel comfortable. I said that using the term, and that's okay. Some individuals and communities may experience diminished safety during some place-based social prescription activities. No two people experience place in the same way. And so we can't really say parks are a safe place for all people, and it should be added in all of our social prescription work. If we look at the history of parks, parks were actually places that were intended for the elite. We've designed cities in a way that have kept low-income people out of parks. Early in the design of parks, parks have been linked to gender-based violence. Parks have erased much of our natural environment and indigenous histories. And so it's very important to understand that all places have fraught histories and people experience places in different ways. And so when we are working with individuals and communities using place-based social prescription approaches, we need to understand what each place represents for each community and each individual as well. Individuals and communities, especially those from historically marginalized communities, have varying levels of access to social prescribing in both formal and informal contexts. And what I want to say about that is that when I talk about using an asset-based lens for social prescription, people will often say, you know, I live in a rural community, and so we can't do it here because we don't have the infrastructure and the amenities. Or I live in a low-income community, like the kind of community where I grew up, and we just don't have the infrastructure, so we can't benefit from this. And one of the things that I always say is, you are absolutely right. You are definitely not wrong about what you're saying, but I always remind people that there's so much magic in the margins, and communities that have faced the most place-based depression are often the communities that are the most imaginative, resilient and compassionate when it comes to place-based rituals and place-based practices and resilience. So I just want to say that as well. Slide, please. So integrating place-based social prescription into your practice, one of the things that I would recommend is to begin by personally practicing place-based prescription yourselves. A rule that I have in my practice is that I never ask people to do anything that I'm unwilling to do. And so if I'm auditing a site using a, let's say, gender-based design lens, and I'm working with hundreds of women, I'm going to share my story and my relationship to that site as well. I think it's very important to practice for ourselves what we are co-leading with community. Also, add place-based questions to intake forms and counseling sessions. I think that is critically important. We really cannot help to improve individual and community wellness if we don't quite literally understand where people are coming from, not just the where in terms of politically and their sort of identities, but like physically, where are people coming from and where are they physically located now, and how is that informing their sense of wellness? Include place-based activities and group sessions and special events. Start place-based social prescription journaling circles. Co-lead place-based social prescription community audits using an asset-based lens, which considers the magic in the margins and the infinite potential to co-create places and spaces that connect, celebrate, and heal. Slide, please. So I'm going to take you back to my community. I started off early in this keynote by telling you about where I grew up and going back and doing that audit. So when I left that community, this isn't a word that I use often, but I felt triggered. It brought back a lot of memories and that trauma of, the loss that we suffered in that neighborhood. And, for years, I was carrying that around and really avoided my community. And during COVID, when I was doing advocacy pertaining to George Floyd, I was also doing some advocacy pertaining to people who lived in dense high-rise buildings that were not condos, so didn't have amenities for people to socially distance, where we were hearing stories of families, losing family members because the whole family got COVID because there was no spare room and there was no special suite on the ground floor for anyone to stay in. And so I was doing some of that advocacy and I felt compelled to go back to my own home community. And so what I did was I, went back. This is my building yet again. And I was really thinking about what could I do? What could I contribute to in this moment? And the daycare was reopening. And I learned that the childcare workers in the daycare had lost their sort of staff room and eating area. So if you look at 1A top, to the left there, where you see those mounds of toys and supplies and that black couch, this is where the women who do the critically important frontline work of caring for our children, this is the space where they were eating their lunch. They were surrounded by mops, chemical cleaning supplies. The ventilator was unexposed, and so the air supply in that room was terrible. The manager to your right is sitting at her desk. They didn't have space to sort of have checked the children for COVID on their way into the daycare. So they were being checked in her office, which means that if a child was carrying, was COVID positive, that she had very high risk of becoming COVID positive as well. We audited things like loose wires and trip hazards and rat feces. We did a top to bottom audit of the site. So myself and 4 architects, and I did a call out to women on my Facebook because my goal was to go into this daycare and transform the site. And the day before we were scheduled to go in, I thought, I'm going to need some help with it. This is a lot to deal with and a lot to contend with. And so whenever I'm overwhelmed in my practice or I have a big job to do, I know that the people for the job are usually women. And so I put out a call on my Facebook the day before, and within 10 minutes, I had a dozen women who put their hands up to come and convert this site with me. So slide, please. We went into this site, and within 48 hours, working around the clock, we transformed the site. So you saw those before pictures. We purchased new toys for the children. We researched daycare design, looked into the proper colors, stimulating things on walls that stimulate and promote growth and learning and curiosity. So we redid these 2 spaces together. The art is brand new. The toys are brand new. We brought the outside inside. So we created a lot of potted plants and a station where children can also learn gardening hands-on within the daycare. Slide, please. I could not get over the space where those women were working. And so that was a big priority for me. We created new storage for those women. We created a seating area. You can't see it now, but there's a table that will flip out when they go into the area to eat their lunch. As you can see, we've opened up the vents so that air is flowing. It's not an ideal staff room, but you can see the before and after. And, it's so critical when we think about individual and community wellness, we rarely think about the people who are doing the work, to keep us all well. We negate those people, and those people are often women, often racialized, often uncelebrated, often underpaid. I can go on and on. And so it was very important for me to give these women a dignified, airy, and light space. Slide, please. And we also transformed the space of that manager, that you can see her office before to the left, and then to the right, we got her air purification in that site. We cleaned her office top to bottom, got her new storage, and she came in on the last day. And she was so moved by the site that she went home and brought her whole family back. And so at the end of the day, when I show up for work every day, it's not about the sort of academic acknowledgement. It's not about the practice awards. It's not about being on stages. At the end of the day, it is about this woman, her family, people being able to have dignified, safe, beautiful places where they belong, places that foster individual and community health. Thank you for allowing me to share with you this morning.
Thank you, Jay. That was so inspiring. Your model is an innovative approach and it is thought-provoking. The story you shared today will have a lasting impact on us all and really shift our perspectives on the sense of place and what it means to our communities. Today is more than just about attending another conference. It is about being part of a movement, and I think Jay started us on that path today. This movement is shaping the future of healthcare and community well-being. I encourage each of you to actively engage and ask questions and share your experiences throughout our time together today. We hope you enjoy the breakout sessions. Thank you for being here, for your dedication to healthier communities, and for your commitment to making a positive impact on the lives that you serve. We will gather here again today at the end, and please send any questions that you may have through the platform, and enjoy the day. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jay.
Thank you. My pleasure.